very much, Leah. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this seminar series. I'm presenting a paper co-authored with Sverker Jagers. Sverker couldn't make it, but he sent his greetings, his regards from a train journey, which he is now on. And maybe some of you who visited Environmental Politics and Governance Conference in Stockholm a couple of years ago will remember this paper. We presented it then, and it's still in progress. There have been some progress, so we hope that there are some new things since we presented before last time. But in any case, this is the same paper if you feel like you remember it. And then the question that guided our research in this direction is the good old, is democracy beneficial for securing environmental protection? And our interest here is driven by a whole range of green political theory literature that says that different ideal types of democracy can have different outcomes. In particular, democracy, especially liberal democracy, has been criticized because it gives it gives protection for individual liberties, and thereby there can be a problem with government intervention for environmental protection, like climate taxes, environmental taxes, and other policy instruments coming from the government. Liberal democracies also tend to have strong markets, so the distribution of power may be skewed towards business interests. In addition, the liberal democracies might have short time horizons that would correspond to that of the market, and at the same time, they will tend to prioritize economic growth. We are trying to be a little bit critical to the literature that criticizes liberal democracies because they do not mention important aspects of liberal democracies, such as the rule of law or constraints on the executive. But what they're saying that these characteristics of liberal democracy that I just mentioned, they actually have negative consequences for environmental commitments of countries. So in order to remedy liberal democracies, researchers said that we should extend the liberal democracy towards something better, like social liberal democracy in its thicker conception. So here, individual liberties may include rights to the healthy environment. So by securing environment as a human right, basic human right, social liberal democracy will allow for environmental protection to enter political agenda and reach implementation stage. And with the social liberal politics, we'll have more leveled out inequality and less extreme poverty, which will allow green preferences to develop. So researchers predict then that social liberal democracies will have a higher potential to develop environmental commitments than liberal democracies. Another solution to remedy liberal democracy that was suggested in green political theory is deliberative democracy, and where researchers argued that broader, deeper, and more enlightened public debate would bring environmental issues towards attention of the politicians and will secure, and sooner or later, environmental protection on the political agenda. So deliberation has been argued to benefit environmental commitments of states. So these are strong and long debated theoretical claims, but so far they have not been tested because there have been no data. But now, with the varieties of democracy projects that measures different concepts of democracy, different conceptions of democracy, including social liberalism, and deliberation, we can measure all these claims in green political theory. And that is what we're trying to do in this paper. So we use the data from the varieties of democracy dataset and construct the indices of thin liberal democracy, social liberal democracy, and deliberative democracy. We also make use of the data from the Economic Freedom Index from the Fraser Institute. This is because the liberal democracy index from the Varieties of Democracy Institute does not really include, or does not include, all of the aspects that have been criticized in the green political theory, including strong influence of the markets and policies. So how we measure our democratic characteristics or democracy types is we take, for thin liberal democracy, for thin liberal characteristics of democracy, we take anything from the Fraser Institute, from this economic index, economic freedom index, on individual and market freedom. Its size of governments, inverted, its protection of property rights, credit market regulations, and so on and so forth. So anything we could find on individual and market freedom, we took. Importantly, we did not include any measure of rule of law and no measure of ease of doing business, because we thought that this taps upon other characteristics of liberal democracy that are not conceptualized or not criticized in a green political theory. And since our goal is to test the claims in green political theory, we should stick to operationalizations that that help us approximate the concepts as much as possible. I do not stretch them too much. To measure social liberal democracy, we take indicators that measure equality in access to healthcare, equality in access to education, expert questions such as spending mostly for public goods or targeted goods, are policies mostly universalistic or means tested, and these are more sort of outcome-oriented measures which help us to infer whether the social liberal politics is practiced in the country to reach these outcomes. These are measures that are also aggregated by the Varieties of Democracy project into the egalitarian democracy, as we call it. To measure deliberative characteristics of democracy, we take questions, expert questions that pertain to the extent of public deliberations, the extent of civil society consultation, and so on. So what we do is we take different indicators or different expert questions or answers to questions, and then we run a factor analysis to construct these indices of democracy characteristics using maximum likelihood. And what we get is pretty distinct characteristics of democracy. And we are very proud of these correlation scores, which are much smaller than VDEM's, Varieties of Democracy original indices, which are around 75. So our strategy is that we try to compare so we run our models with the different democracy types, and a model with all democracy types included in one model. And so we compare effect sizes on these coefficients, regression coefficients for these democracy models, and compare model fit statistics between these different models and significance, obviously. We run our models for several samples. First, we only take democracies of the world, or democracies for which we have data for, and then see kind of within the democracy sample, democracies with which characteristics tend to perform better in one or the other environmental indicator, which I'll talk about in a second. And we distinguish democracies and non-democracies using Bjornskov-Rodé index, which is an extension from Chebuk's dichotomous democracy indicator. Secondly, we multiply this democracy dummy from Bjornskov-Rodé with our characteristic scores, where autocracy is coded as 0. And this way, we are seeing how much these different democracies or countries where, or democracies where different characteristics are more pronounced, by how much they outperform autocracies. And then we also, for pure curiosity reasons, just test whether these characteristics are important for authoritarian regimes, if we include authoritarian regimes as well. So we do not limit the sample to democracies and do not code democracies, just use democracy as a control variable and see thin liberalism, deliberation, and social liberalism are important to explain environmental outcomes of countries. Our dependent variable, the parent dependent variables are several, and we are trying to operationalize environmental commitments with anything we could find on the internet. If you have any other suggestions of what we can use as proxies for environmental commitments, not environmental outcomes, because we think it's a little bit too far-fetched. It's easier to make inferences on the effect of democracy on what governments can actually do, which is policies, laws. So the first dependent variable is the effect of climate laws on CO2 emissions, and I will talk in a second of what that means. Second is environmental policy stringency index, which is available for the OECD countries, plus 6 more. And BTI, environmental concern index, what they call it. It's an expert question that asks whether environmental concerns are taken into account in the country's regulation system. And this is only available for the developing countries. And we control for GDP per capita, trade openness, time in the EU, and corruption. So this first dependent variable is actually inspired by the article from Eskander&Frankhauser in Nature Climate Change, published a couple of months ago, where they estimate the effect of the number of climate laws on the emissions levels. And what we do is we replicate their model and we introduce an interaction effect between the number of laws and our democracy types. So this actually kind of allows us to compare which types of democracies or democracy with which more pronounced characteristics are more successful in translating the number of their climate change mitigation laws into actual emission reductions. And for environmental policy stringency and environmental efforts from this BTI indicator, we run between model where we compare coefficients between countries and within countries. And here are our results. These are interaction effects plots for different democracy indicators, and what they essentially show is that democracies with liberal characteristics and social liberal characteristics tend to tend to translate the number of adopted laws, they adopted mitigation laws into the actual CO2 emission reductions, but not deliberative democracies. As for environmental policy stringency in OECD, it seems that only social liberal democracies tend to have higher environmental policy stringency than the rest. But we also find that more deliberation is associated with lower environmental policy stringency in fixed effects models, which is a bit unexpected, but really interesting to think. And for the developing countries sample, we also find that social liberal countries with democracies with social liberal characteristics tend to have higher exert higher environmental efforts in their regulation than other democracies, or less social liberal democracies, and other democracy types. So the summary of our results is that we find no negative effects from thin liberalism or market capitalism that the green political theories criticize. Social liberal characteristics in democracies seem to be beneficial, but deliberative characteristics less so. So we do not find any effect of deliberation, any sound effect of deliberation, and even find some signs of the negative effect, which we interpret as perhaps influence of business interests during the deliberations. The reservation of our study is that we actually do not have ideal democracy types. So it's we found it's very difficult to test all these claims in green political theory, because what countries have these days is just more or less pronounced characteristics of these different democracy ideal types, but none of them can be actually characterized as ideal type, or very, very few. So we cannot really make a comparison that we plan to do. And more importantly, we don't have, while we can find some examples of liberal democracies, thin liberal democracies, or social liberal democracies, we do not have deliberative democracies, at least not in the conception that political theories thought of. So I will stop here and can just leave the slide for a moment, which reveals the ranking of countries within the OECD on each of the democracy conceptions. Thank you.